he told me that when you open your eyes in the morning, you give a prayer to the Creator. And I've been doing that for some time now. I've been thinking about what it is I need to pray about. And it's been an interesting road for me in terms of how I need to look at life. And this morning when I woke up and I knew we were coming to an event like this, I was wondering how I should pray, and the only thing that came to my mind was the Blue Jays this morning. I was hoping that they win their first game tonight. But, and I was wondering if that was kind of wrong, but I don't think so. I think it kind of led me to something else. I remember the memories that I had going to watch the Blue Jays with my family and my children, and sitting next to them and cheering on somebody in unity with so many other people. And I started thinking about how I can utilize that story to maybe inspire other people to think about how they're going to utilize their prayers. So today, as I began this day, I thought of that fire that's burning, and the fire that's not just burning here, but the fire that's burning in the hearts of our people, wanting to see a brighter future, a stronger place for this world to live in unity. Because when I look across this beautiful planet that the Creator provided for us, I see there's beauty, but there's also dangers. And when I look at climate change, when I look at the destruction that's happening within our environment, and how we're going to rebalance that once again, that all came to me in this prayer this morning too. And it was all about how I can put this into perspective so my next generation will have an understanding. Because when I seen the elder in our community pass away 2 weeks ago, I remembered the knowledge that she took with her. And I wonder how that knowledge is going to be presented to me and then to the next generation to come. So then I started thinking, maybe that should be a part of this prayer this morning. Maybe that should be something that I need to revive within myself. And then it came to the important part of what my grandfather also told me was about natural law. If you've ever heard of that word of natural law, you know that the natural way of being is how we are and how Creator made us. If you look at trees, they only grow in certain directions, and if the rivers that flow without changing from mankind flows in a particular direction that's natural. We need to look at our natural environment and our natural beings so that we can have this opportunity to create that wealth of knowledge that those elders who are moving on really try to put into our minds. So I think it kind of started to make sense to me of why we need to take a look at how we pray and how we talk to the Creator. Sometimes we use it in different methods. We put our tobacco down and we ask Creator for guidance. And sometimes we do it in our pipe ceremonies when we're asking for assistance when somebody needs our help in a healing ceremony or a naming ceremony. And sometimes we don't have a tobacco opportunity to put it down. So sometimes we need to just look at our hearts and see how that connects with the Creator. And when I see the ceremonies that are taking place that have been going on this land for generations and generations, I think of the protocols that exist. We are on the lands of beautiful people, the original people of this land that did ceremonies on this land and did it in certain ways that were strong and had an important value to their life. But then sometimes I pulled myself out of the Medieval Lodge or the Longhouse, and I stood there by myself and I said, the real ceremony that I think is most important is one I have with my Creator directly. I can do it in protocols, but I need to do it from my heart, even inside those lodges, even inside those longhouses. But if I'm standing out in the area where the animals live, I can still do that if I'm sitting near a river. And I hope that river continues to be there for our future generations to come, unpoisoned by these pipelines, unpoisoned by the disasters of technology that sometimes play an important role. So I think today, with this opening and with this ability to remember the teachings of our elders And going forward from this moment, I'd really like to honor all those that brought that traditional knowledge to each and every one of us in such a very pleasant manner. Those ones who are gone to that spirit world, who still inspire us, still give us that strength to be who we are, and in recognition of them, we stand up in front of people and we tell these stories. You come and speak to an elder, and you come and listen to those beautiful teachings that we've presented from generation to generation. So tonight, or this morning, if you go to that fire, think about that as you're putting tobacco in that beautiful fire and watching that prayer go up to the Creator's world, and have that opportunity to think about all those things you're grateful for, natural law, and all those inspirational people. I wanted to acknowledge, and I was told I always need to acknowledge my parents and my grandparents and everything that I do, because they brought me to this world. And they were subject to the dangers that existed in the residential school that they sat in. And they were told that it wasn't very nice to be able to speak our language, and it wasn't very necessary for us to learn our ways, because that was what they were taught. And then when we find ourselves and we look at how this beauty of our ways really guide our life, it kind of set a different stage for me with my parents, because they didn't really accept the fact that I was learning my language and my culture. And it wasn't that they didn't want that, it was just that was how it was beaten into them at a young age, and they felt that it wasn't going to do me any good. So I'm honored to stand in front of you today with the part that my parents couldn't contribute to, saying prayers in our language. It's something that they, I think, wish they could, but they couldn't tell me, because they thought every time they gave encouragement to add to culture, that they would be beaten. And I know that, because on my father's dying day, he told me that. He said it wasn't that I didn't like the culture. He said it was every time I thought about giving it to you, there was somebody in the back of my mind that was going to punish me for that. He said I couldn't even give you a hug, because it turned to me as a youngster into an abuse that I don't want to talk about. He said all those things that you're doing and you're presenting to your children is what I wanted to do, but it was taken from me. And I need to take this opportunity to tell you as I go to visit the Creator that I'm very proud of you. And that was one of the most proudest days of my life, to know that, because I didn't know that my whole life. I thought he just didn't care for all those things, but he couldn't tell me those things. So I think we're in that stage right now of transition. We're learning that these things are beautiful. And I need to bring this to your attention, that those teachings that you get, no matter how you get them, to utilize them and to give them that chance to help grow for these generations to come. So with that said, I'd like to offer something that my parents couldn't do, the prayer in the Anishinaabe language. Abujo maingan deshi kasta shkan zibe no no mingodin ichi manado chi wetsmin wa kena mawuje ko kena magiwe ichi manado chi wetsmin wa kena mashkiki osama wingash mashko dewish minwe ije ichi manado chi wetsmin wa kena wa banong jawanong epping nish mukki we nam ichi manado chi wetsmin wa kena mino pamada ziwe. And I hope our Creator heard those prayers, because they're true, and the things that I have in connection with this beautiful land is that I want to do my best to preserve it for those generations to come. I want them to have that river that's clean. I want them to have that tree, that we grew up with, and watching their smiles, as they look at our beautiful Mother the Earth and carry forward with the strength that she gives them. So I'd like to begin this day, and I'm going to offer a quick smudge just in the circle down here. And we'll do the cleansing for today's teaching, because you're going to learn a lot of things. You're going to be, I think, inspired. You're going to be blessed by teachings. You're going to be surrounded by knowledge today. You're going to be given some direction when you go home tonight. And when you put your head on your pillow, you're going to be a little confused because of all the information that's going to go into your heart and your soul today. Because when I've seen the lineup, I know that this place has been blessed by so much talent and so much wisdom that it's going to take some time to dissect all that. So I want to cleanse this area as our speakers come up and begin this beautiful day together. They said the medicines is for cleansing, getting rid of that negativity. It gives us a chance to see that maybe something we wouldn't be able to see by washing our eyes, our mouth so we can speak better, our ears so we can hear better. We take that medicine that Creator gave us to give us that chance to heal. And to know that the sage, the Mashkodewish, is all about the teaching of the elder. If you think of an elder with long gray hair and looking really, really beautiful, they know sometimes that lifespan of theirs is coming toward that western door. And they need to teach these things before they leave this beautiful world. So the Mashkodewish, or the sage, is rather strong because the teachings need to be strong. And the elders who tell that story want to make sure that it's said while they're still in this world. So we cleanse this with the knowledge, we cleanse this area so that those elders and those people who are speaking have that inspiration to know that for a moment this can be a very sacred place. Because it's always sacred when we hear our stories from our heart. It's always sacred that we've reached back and remembered those things. And it's always sacred when we come together as people of all races in this world and all parts of this world. Just like the seeds that went out from those birds that planted all those beautiful things. We all come together to learn today. So this place is open and ready, and I'd like to ask these beautiful singers to come back and do another song for us and begin this day in such a beautiful way. Thank you very much.
Ani, my name is Megan Border-Manawab, and I'm part of the Mino de Kwewaknigamawak, the Good-Hearted Women Singers. I have been singing with this drum group since I was very young. The drum circle was started by community elder Jean Becker in 2003, and later passed on to Kelly Larilla. We have been going for 13 years now. We have been taught to follow the 7 grandfather teachings. These are the values of love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, truth, and wisdom. These teachings guide us in our relationships with ourselves and each other, and they help guide us towards living our lives in a balanced way. They are also represented in the logo for the Truth and Reconciliation, 7 Flames and 7 Sacred Teachings. The Good-Hearted Women Singers are committed to doing what we can to build better relationships between Indigenous and settler peoples, and contributing to reconciliation. We are reaching out to all peoples, and we come together to sing and talk with one another. Real change requires relationships. We need to get to know each other so there will be a better future for us all. Miigwech.
Away. You don't need it. Go ahead.
Sego ani in Anishinaabe Moen, Western Dekwe Indigenous, Mizike do Dem, Six Nations Dunjua and Kitchener Andam. I am honored and privileged to be able to thank first off my Aidan Henry, who is not only the manager of the Aboriginal Services at Conestoga College, but is also part of his own band, council, Chippewa the Thames, who is fighting Line 9 right now in Supreme Court. So to have him here today with us, to take time out of his busy schedule, is really an honor, and I thank you for that. Thank you for your words in this much. As well, Nino, for being here and taking the time out of your day to open the space with a welcome song. Thank you so much for that. I wanted to speak a little bit on behalf of the Waterloo Aboriginal Education Centre. As a student here, I am doing my second degree, and I'm doing my practicum placement with the Waterloo Aboriginal Education Centre. So I spend more time there than I did in the last 3 years, which is not really possible, but it's a lot of hours there. And it's important. It's important for us. It's important for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students to have a place that we can connect to have a place on campus that we can call home. Megan did that for me at Conestoga College, and Jean Becker will do that for me at Wilfrid Laurier when I'm there next year. So it's important in this community to have those connections, and between the post-secondary connections. We have more graduates coming out of University of Waterloo, Conestoga College, and Wilfrid Laurier that are First Nations, that are Inuit Métis, because of the support services that they provide for us. I know as a mature student, I would never have made it through without them all. So I just wanted to thank everybody for being here. In particular, we wanted to thank Soroya, who, it's funny, when we first heard of Soroya, we were in the center, and we heard of this professor who was going to write the names, the known names of the murdered and missing Indigenous women on the art squad out front here. And we thought, how do we not know this woman? How do we not know who she is? And we grabbed our drums. There were at least a dozen of us, along with some of the good-hearted women who had heard in the community that she was doing this statement of solidarity and honor out front, right in front of the art squad. And it was important to us to honor her and to be there for such an important moment. So we ran down with our drums, and we invited Soraya into the circle, and I think it was probably the first time we'd ever drummed with us. And she came to us not long afterwards and said, I have this idea for this conference or summit or symposium, and even that she wondered what kind of wording should she use. Was she being respectful? Do we call it a conference? Do we call it workshops? Circles is what we told her. So in the fact that she came to us, the Indigenous students, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Center on campus, to ask what we thought, to ask for our input, to consult with us, which First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people are not often done with. That was a huge honor and privilege for us. We sat down for our first meeting. I sat down with my last meeting recently and realized what it took for this woman to bring this together, for all of us to integrate our knowledge in 3 days. It's a very short time. We could have made it a whole week, and she worked so hard that it probably could have been a whole week. But we invite you to share with us and join me in welcoming and thanking Soroya Mom for what she's done.
Yeah, this has been it's been a long journey, but it's been a wonderful journey in that it's been a process of learning, of connecting, and it's impossible to do these types of any project actually alone. And I think as scholars and academics, you get very focused in your work and getting all those things. But I don't think that is actually what it's about. It's about collaborative processes and learning, and particularly Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and how can we begin to communicate better? How do we address the issues of the past and really address them and listen to the people who are speaking them and trying to move forward from there? So it has been a process, and I'm so grateful to people like Amy, to the Waterloo Aboriginal Education Center, Lou, Cheryl, and Sean, Emma, who said yes. And they have just been supportive from that moment. The University of Waterloo, I'm grateful, Arts in particular, for just, again, saying yes. We're here to challenge the institution. We're here to challenge why isn't territory acknowledged? And I'd like to do that right now. I'd like to acknowledge this territory that I'm grateful to be on to do this work. Territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral, Six Nations. My students ask me, why don't I know this? This is an important question, and it's not rhetorical. So I'd like to thank the University of Waterloo for allowing us to be here and to challenge that. I'd like to thank Shirk for saying yes to make this happen, Shirk Connection Grant, but also the people behind that, Angela Rorda, Tim Kenyon, Tom Barber, who helped and was very patient with me in that granting process. I'd like to thank the Center for Memory and Testimony Study out of Laurier, particularly Kim Anderson. And she, again, has been there from the beginning. She had her students make 600 tobacco ties. When you go to them with fire, those tobacco ties are from Kim. Ontario Arts Council, Bob Harding Grant, REAP, in particular with technology. All the people here today who are facilitating. I'd like to thank Jen Doyle, our conference manager, and Emma Smith as well. I'd also like to just take a moment and honor the people who survived the legacy of the residential school. They're here today to share their stories, and I'm grateful that they are here. I'm grateful for their courage, and I'm grateful for the knowledges that they can bring. I would just like to also take a moment to thank everyone for being part of this process. All the speakers who are coming to the circles and again participating in this process. And I'd like to end and conclude with a quote from Mohawk poet Beth Brandt. And she was creating a book of poetry from First Nations women. And she concludes her book by saying, it doesn't end here, it begins. And so we begin this conference. And thank you to everyone.
And again, such an honor and privilege to introduce the next speaker. I normally sit in the audience when these people speak, so it's really a different view from here to be on the same stage with these people. Jean Becker is the Senior Advisor for the Office of Aboriginal Initiatives at Wilfrid Laurier University. But she started our center here at the University of Waterloo many years ago. And I thank you for that. You've given me a second home, as so many when it comes to the college. But I have sat in ceremony with Jean Becker. She has taught me so many things about being a First Nations woman, about being a community member, about being a student. And I'm honored to introduce Ms. Jean Becker.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. I'd actually like to return the thanks of everybody. I'm really grateful to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to introduce our speaker this morning. I heard her speak maybe 10, 12 years ago, and she has been my hero ever since that time. I've followed her as she's been doing all of her work around the country. And this morning I'm particularly moved to introduce her. Having heard on the way in this morning about the tragedy in Saskatchewan, where 3 young women took their own lives. And Cindy Blackstock is one of the forces of change that is making an impact here in Canada and across the world through her work with the United Nations. And I'm I'm so hopeful for the future for our children, but I'm also this morning very, very present to the work is not done, and we really, really need this woman's voice. Executive Director, First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, and a professor at the School of Social Work in McGill University. A member of the Gitxsan First Nation, Cindy has 25 years of social work experience in child protection and Indigenous children's rights. Her promotion of culturally based equity for First Nations children and families and engaging children in reconciliation has been recognized by the Nobel Women's Initiative, the Aboriginal Achievement Foundation, Frontline Defenders, and many others. An author of over 50 publications and a widely sought after public speaker, you'll see why after you hear her speak, Cindy recently completed a Master of Jurisprudence degree, congratulations, and currently serves as a commissioner for the Pan American Health Organization Commission on Health Equity and Inequity. I'd like you to welcome Cindy Blackstock.
Jamie Winjack was just a little boy. He just wanted to grow up and with people who knew his language, knew his culture, that would feed him, give him a hug, teach him how to be a man. Maybe one day he'd have his own family and his own children be loved by that circle too. But he found himself being placed in residential school and walking 600 miles to go home in the depth of winter, away from the place who tried to change him into something he was not, away from the place that treated him brutally and the other children as well, away from a place that was supposed to teach him to be civilized, and yet which brutality and savagery he had never seen before. Jamie Winjack never made it home. He died on the railroad tracks, like many other children. And his story kept alive in the memories of his family and his community, and more recently sung by Gord Downie. When people hear of Jamie's story, you might find yourself thinking, if I was there, if I was one of the people of that period, I would have acted out, I would have done something. I would have made sure his hair didn't get cut. I would have made sure, I would have placed myself between that person who was trying to hit him and that little boy. I would have done something to make it stop. And the way that we comfort ourselves is we say people of the period didn't know any better back then. A lot of people talk about the conversation of reconciliation as being between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and non-Aboriginal. But that's not the story I want to share with you today. I want to talk about the three pillars of reconciliation: the government who has been the wrongdoer, the people of the period, and the whistleblowers who have always been amongst us, who always knew something was terribly wrong. Why is it that the whistleblowers have been screaming into silence for so long? What is it about the ongoing racism of the Canadian government that makes us all mute and silent? Why is it that academics spend so much time talking about First Nations capacity building. And yet we never turn our minds to why the government of Canada has always known better and never done better for First Nations children. Why are there no articles about that? Why isn't anyone looking at that? These are the children of the period. These children are from Norway House Cree Nation. And as you can see, they are beautiful. They are children who dream to become teachers, to become the best artists, the musicians, to be able to sing their traditions. They are the children who will be tomorrow's elders, grandparents. And they are the children who are screaming into silence. You see, because this year, in January, the Canadian government was found responsible for racially discriminating against these children by providing them fewer public services in child welfare than any other child in this country gets. Racial discrimination is federal fiscal policy. So why is it not even in the newspapers? Why isn't it the thing that the Blue Jays, why isn't there audiences like that rising up against this? Why aren't we talking about it? That's a story I want to talk about. This is Duncan Campbell Scott. I spent a lot of my time thinking about Duncan Campbell Scott because in his story is part of the answer of how good people can do terrible things. And it's also a story about academia. I'm going to argue throughout this talk that academia and university education in particular were absolutely vital for the carriage of residential schools. We train the people who are in the residential schools. We train the people of the period to do, as Gord Downey says, we have been trained our entire lives not to see it. We have done that in universities. Duncan Campbell Scott, many people know him, of course, as the longest serving bureaucrat in Indian Affairs in charge of the residential school file. He was appointed by John A. Macdonald himself at the age of 17. It was not Duncan Campbell Scott's dream to work in the civil service. He had other aspirations for himself. He wanted to be a medical doctor, just like his uncle. But his father was a parishioner and did not have the financial means to send Duncan off to medical school, and so by default, he ends up in the civil service. Now, he was always a reluctant public servant. That wasn't his real passion. His real passion was, he was a great musician, actually. Played the violin, played the piano, and he was always captured by letters. And although he only had a grade 12 education, he actually served as the president of the Royal Society. And here is his address from 1922, his presidential address about history, and I find it so fascinating. He says, the former storytelling function of history and the endless reweaving of that tissue of tradition, which surrounded and obscured the life of a people, has given place to a higher conception of the duty of the historian and the obligation to accept no statement without the support of documentary evidence. The exploration and study of archives and the collation of original contemporaneous documents are now held to be essential, and the partisan historian, fortified with bigotry and blind to all evidence incongenial to his perceptions, is an extinct being. I wonder, as Scott wrote this, if he knew the stories historians were telling him. It's a lesson to us all. Our obituaries are not written by the people who love us. Our obituary is written in the actions we choose to take or not take during our lifetime. This is the earliest document on child welfare in Canada. First Nations children are 12 times more likely today to be put in foster care because of poverty, poor housing, and caregiver substance misuse related to the multi-generational impacts of residential schools. Overall, Aboriginal children are estimated to make up 50% of the child in care population. That's over 3 times the number of First Nations children that were in state care at the height of residential schools or living away from their families today. So who here thinks the foster care system is failing First Nations kids? I disagree with all of them. I think it's succeeding tragically at what it was designed to do. This is a warrant requisitioned by Duncan Campbell Scott, a very young Duncan Campbell Scott in that area. It's dated 1895. It's issued, interestingly enough, by our Department of Justice. And I'm going to suggest to you that the Department of Justice is more often been the perpetrator of injustice when it comes to First Nations than it has been the upholders of justice. In fact, it has flagrantly violated its own laws. But because we're not looking at the government so often, we don't see it or we excuse it. This warrant is very interesting in that when I have a copy, which I have in my office, and it actually petrifies me every time I look at it, you can see it's written so politely. Your obedient servant. And there's a line in there about the removal of Indian children because for the purposes of education, which was residential schools, which we know was not them, but also because they were not properly cared for. That's why Cheney was taken from his family and put into that school, is because he was not deemed to be properly cared for. And what a lot of people don't know about the residential school history is they were actually child welfare placements from the very beginning. In fact, by the 1950s, over 40% of children in child welfare, in residential schools were put there under the not properly cared for provision, the neglect provision. And the same problem that exists in this warrant exists today in child welfare. And that is that we codify structural discrimination as a parental deficit. We never ask ourselves, if we were to put other families in these same conditions, how well would they be doing? We never ask ourselves that question. And we also wrongly assume that we are removing children from desperate situations and putting them into something that's at least benign, if not utopia. Well, I did child protection work on the front lines for 13 years. I was one of those people who removed some of those kids. And I can tell you, it is a very rare circumstance where the child welfare system has something better to offer. And I am not a utopian thinker. I think some of our kids need to be in foster care, but not at these rates. And why is it that the child welfare system does risk assessments on families, but not risk assessments on the option it has on offer? Right? Why don't we do that? We don't even do that with therapeutic interventions, right? It's not just child welfare that doesn't do this. It's a whole host of professions that proclaim themselves benevolent, and therefore they don't even think about the harm that they could be perpetrating. They are providing something better, is the assumption from where people came from. Now this is one of the people of the period who's one of my greatest heroes. In fact, the day before Prime Minister Harper's apology, I found myself in Beechwood Cemetery in Ottawa. And I had stopped off at the Byward Market and I had bought myself a bouquet of brightly colored Gerber daisies. Because to me, they represented the brightness of children. And for those of you who've never been to Beechwood, you really should go there. It's a national cemetery for Canada, and many prime ministers are buried there. I find something very curious about cemeteries. I'm actually very curious about obituaries. Have you ever read the obituaries? Where are all the people who stepped on top of everybody's career to get to the top of the line? Why isn't that in the obituary? Where is that person whose lifelong dream was to own 10 cars and who ignored the poor people he walked by every day? Where is his obituary? It's the same in the cemeteries. Except there, I think I find clear answers. Have you ever seen the huge monuments people build? You know, the big gravestones with like the obelisk from the Egyptian era? I don't mean any disrespect, but I don't think that helps you in the next one. If you lived yourself like that, right? I don't know, maybe I'm in the minority, but past those huge monuments. And I found the most modest gravestone in a valley in front of a maple tree. And that's just right that it's in front of a very naughty maple tree, because the elders of the Algonquin Nation tell me that it's really the predisposition of maples to grow straight. And yet this one has all kinds of knots in it. And just before it is Peter Henderson Bryce. See, he was a man of the period. He is a person who puts a big red hot poker stick into the Canadian conscience because he knew that. You see, he was Canada's first health officer. He wrote the health code, which is the reason why most people off reserve can get clean water, why you have vaccinations for children. He wrote all that. He was also the president of the American Public Health Association. He was considered by most the most eminent physician, if not in Canada, or if not in North America of his period. He saved thousands of lives by stopping the trains coming from Montreal and passing on communicable diseases to those who lived in Ottawa. And at the age of 51, being an expert in communicable diseases, he's hired by the federal government, by a guy named Duke, to go out and survey the health of kids in residential schools. And what he finds in 1904 to 1907 is horrifying to him. The death rate is 24%. He would literally walk by graveyards to get to the schools. Now, you didn't need to be a rocket scientist, even in that period, to realize that's an alarm. Right? How many non-Aboriginal schools have you seen in that period where there would be grave markers outside of the schools? Now, Bryce tracks the children over 3 years. He finds the death rate well over 40%, and in Final Hills Residential School, 78%. He says medical science knows just what to do to save these kids. You don't put sick kids in with healthy kids. You improve the ventilation. You don't exhaust the children into servitude. You make sure they have a proper diet. And in that day, because people all say, well, non-Aboriginal people were dying of TB in that day too, and that's true. But not at the rates of First Nations. And as Bryce pointed out, the budget for TB prevention and treatment in the city of Ottawa was much higher than that of the whole Indian Affairs Department provided to First Nations from the whole country. He comes back to Ottawa and he says to Wilfrid Laurier and to Scott and others, it's cost about $10,000 to $15,000 to fix this. We can save these kids' lives, many of their lives. And the government of Canada says, no, that's too expensive. Too much money. Now, Bryce did not give up. You see, he kept on speaking up in the government, and he was persecuted as a result. He had his research funding cut. He was forbidden for speaking about his research results in conferences. He was denied promotions, and eventually pushed out of the public service. But that didn't stop him. Who here has been to Ottawa? Quite a few. Most of you have walked up Spark Street, haven't you? Huh? So if you walk past the War Memorial, and there's the old post office right at the corner there. Right beside it is this building, James Hope and Sons. It still stands today. And in 1922, Dr. Bryce walks in there with a manuscript. It's called A National Crime. He's going to publicize this horrendous wrongdoing by the Canadian government in the hopes that the Canadian public is going to rise up. Who, he says, would possibly tolerate this needless death? My fellow citizens are good citizens. As soon as they know, they will rise up and they will insist the government does that. This was his second attempt. He actually tried it in 1907, where his research was carried in the front pages of the Ottawa Citizen newspaper and newspapers across Canada. But the public failed him then, but he felt determined they would hear him now. And so he publishes this manuscript. You can see it was 35 cents. But he gave them away free to members of Parliament, and to members of the clergy and senior business people. But nothing happened, and the children continued to die. Children continued to die. We, the public, the people of the period, were more interested in other things. Somehow we normalize this. The government would never do anything like this. The government must have its reasons for doing this. But Bryce wasn't alone. You see, in 1907, when his article was on the front pages of the newspaper, there was a guy named Samuel Hume Blake who was reading that article. He's one of the founders of Blake's Law Firm. Very interesting family, the Blakes. Of course, because we have Edward Blake, who was one of the first premiers of Ontario, who actually put the bounty up for the head of Riel, right, Louis Riel. And his brother was the exact opposite, who was a pamphleteer and social justice advocate, Samuel Hume Blake. And he reads Bryce's report in a newspaper, and he says, and he's a judge, by the way, he says that in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. So it's clear that people of the period thought A, this was morally wrong, and B, quite very possibly criminal. Right? But they weren't the only whistleblowers. This is Edward B. Edward B. is a little boy like Cheney who was in residential schools at that time. And he wrote this letter to Dear Parent. And as you can see, it's written in the Christmas season of 1923. And I want to take a moment to really recognize the work of John Malloy, the historian, who wrote the book A National Crime, which I think should be mandatory reading for everybody. Because it tells the story of residential schools from the perspective of Canada's documents. And it was John who sent me Edward's letter. It's written, Dear Parent. And as you can see, little Edward is talking about how hungry he and the other boys are in school. So hungry that they're eating cats and wheat. And as a little boy, the only thing he can think of doing when the teacher is so cruel to him is to strike out at her the next time that happens. Well, we don't know if Edward B's letter ever got to his parents. But we do know someone very important did read it. 99% of the children in residential schools are too fat anyway, said Duncan Campbell Scott in response to Edward B's letter. Remember I said that Duncan Campbell Scott was the president of the Royal Society? Well, he served as president in 1922. That was a year, the very same year, that Bryce in Ottawa, just a couple of blocks away from where the Royal Society would have been, was circulating his pamphlet. So where was our academic community? Wouldn't that raise a few eyebrows? Why weren't we calling Duncan Campbell Scott to account back then? After all, one of the reasons we have academic freedom is because we're supposed to speak up about things like this. And there were people among us who were doing it. Dr. Bryce was doing it and getting persecuted inside the Federal Civil Service. A judge was doing it, whose brother had very contrary views to him. But where was all the academics? Where were we throughout this entire history? It is one of the most profound failures of Canadian academia, I would argue. Let's roll the tape forward a few years. And I should say that Bryce dies in 1932 in obscurity. In fact, very few, his name and his legacy are erased from the Canadian history books, even though we heard from Scott at the beginning that that is exactly what history was designed not to do. But he was erased out of the Canadian story. But Duncan Campbell Scott had a very different experience. When he retired, the government of Canada held a big reception for him for his loyal public service and to honor him as a Confederate poet. He is appointed as a distinct person of distinction in the Canadian history. In fact, if you go to the Government of Canada's website, he's still on there. Huh? This great person. Prizes were named after him, Duncan Campbell Scott, for his poetry. I first met Duncan Campbell Scott when I was in high school. I met his legacy much before that, in the harms that were happening to people in my own community. But I met him as a person in Canadian literature class. And he was taught as a great Canadian poet. But even back then, I didn't know high school. putting him up against Wordsworth and Dryden and Chaucer, and then we had Duncan Campbell. It just felt a little let down. This is 1948, so this was just shortly after Duncan Campbell Scott died, actually. And what is interesting about this letter is you can see it's a letter from the Kamloops Indian Residential School to parents, where the residential school folks are going to give them the privilege of having their children back for the holidays. Remember that not properly cared for provision, that assumption that we have something better? You can see it coming through these letters. Huh? I have another letter very similar to this, but dated in the 70s. And it's an Indian Affairs social worker writing to superiors and saying, we have to do home visits on some of the First Nations children before they go home from residential schools because we don't know if it's safe for them. Now, in fairness to this person, they realize that not all First Nations parents are a danger to their kids. They're saying some. And doesn't it just sound reasonable? We'll just make sure the kids are safe before we send them home. Until you realize that that letter was written by a social worker at St. Anne's Residential School. The same residential schools where there's prolific sexual abuse, but where they also had an electric chair for the amusement and the punishment of the children. That's how blind we were. That's how complicit we were in this whole process. And it wasn't, of course, just in child welfare that we had these problems. This is a report in 1967. And what I find so interesting is it talks then. This is a guy named Caldwell. It's done for the Department of Indian Affairs. One of the other assumptions is that Canada does these wrongs because it doesn't know any better. Right? And we heard from Bryce's story that that was completely untrue. They had a solution, right? They could have saved these kids. 10 to 15,000 bucks was not a lot of money even back then for our national treasury. But here we have Caldwell. And he is finding in Saskatchewan 80% of the kids are in residential schools under that not properly cared for provision. Of course, around the same time, we have provincial child welfare statutes being rolled out. And we have the 60s scoop pattern, right? Which is non-Aboriginal social workers primarily going out and saying, we have something better to care for your kids, and they're pulling them out without doing anything about the structural issues that were putting those kids at risk. So this is written in 1967, and you can see the recommendation there from Caldwell, right? We need to be investing in these families. Like, why do we have all these kids in these schools, right? I was 3 years old then. I was one of those kids who could have been helped. But Caldwell's calls to action were ignored. That same year, here in Ontario, we have Alex Sims writing about the inequities in education for First Nations kids. In fact, he has a great phrase on page 35 of this report. It says, can anyone hazard a guess as to what year or what century real equality will happen in the learning of Indian children? He argues for Indian control over education. He argues for the inclusion of Indigenous lessons within mainstream education. He argues for equity in instructions and in teachers and in proper schools. He wrote this for Indian Affairs, and it was ignored. It was ignored. 1996 comes around, we have the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. They do a detailed study of all the situation of colonization and what can be done to fix the situation. The end goal was a plan that was to walk away from the Indian. We are the only country in the Western industrialized world that has a race-based piece of legislation. Who here would volunteer to have a blood quantum test to test your Canadian identity and citizenship? I've often wondered that about Parliament, as I see the parliamentarians wandering. How many of them, even if I gave them the credit of saying the Vikings, who were here first, it wasn't the British and the French, the Vikings, the British, and the French, if they could prove 50% blood quantum back to the original boat that came over, how many parliamentarians would qualify for status Canadian citizenship? And yet we still apply it here. And we also cover that covert unbelievable racism in an assumption that it's benevolent. Look at all the perks you get with being an Indian, right? Like I remember, I'm a Status City, I remember going to school in university, and everybody around me thought I got a free education. I have 4 academic degrees. The amount of money given to me by the Department of Indian Affairs or any government in Canada for my education rounds out at exactly 0. There are some grants, but they're so limited, very few people can access them. And very few people are getting a free education. And even if you do get a free education, you had to overcome on reserve funding of education at 50% or 30% less than what every other Canadian kid got. Right? So I say to my college university classes, who here would trade off a free university education, but you have to go your first 12 years on the basis of 50 cents or 70 cents on the dollar? And if you're lucky enough to actually make it to university, then I'll pay for it free. Who would like to do that? Right? So what we have is this narrative being woven, this sophisticated narrative being woven by the Canadian government. As Robert E. Williams, a Native American legal scholar, says, the dichotomy, the embedding of the dichotomy of the savage and the civilized. We are the savages, and everybody else is the civilized. That's why we can't properly look after our own kids. That's why they're not properly looked after. That's the deep narrative. That's why we're not good at managing our own money. That's the deep narrative of that dichotomy, right? And as people like Daniel Paul, the historian, Mi'kmaq historian, says, it is true. There was savagery in the history of Canada, but it was rarely perpetrated by Indigenous people. It was rarely perpetrated by Indigenous people. But the narrative is so strong it blinds us. It blinds us and allows for these inequalities to play out in everyday society, even amongst Indigenous people. We have normalized it, right? We have normalized it. Sheila Fraser notes in her numerous reports by the Auditor General, she did over a 10-year term about 18 reports on different First Nations programs. She says across the board, First Nations people are getting less. Less water, less housing, less funding for basics like sewer, less money for First Nations education, less money for First Nations child welfare, across the board. And yet that doesn't pierce the Canadian narrative. It doesn't raise the Canadian consciousness. And the reason for that is that wonderful weaving, that colonial weaving of the narrative of civilized and the savage. And we make excuses all the time. Like, for example, the government of Canada says it's too complex to get clean drinking water up to a northern community. And yet, we got a clean glass of water up to one guy up in the space station. Then there's the good old First Nations cannot manage their money. What we need first is accountability. And on the front page, we have proof because on the front pages of the paper we'll find a few First Nations folks who are fraudulent. They're not using their money properly. Now, there are some First Nations people who are not managing their money well, and in fact, there are some First Nations people committing fraud. But I live in Ottawa. So why is it that we only thought it was okay to pass a First Nations Accountability Act? When I looked at the major fraudsters in Canada, they call it white collar crime more because of it's more than just the collar that's white. But we don't even think of those people of a racial act on accountability. And that is the proper way of thinking about it. We should hold wrongdoers accountable for their own actions. But you don't legitimize a whole system of racial discrimination by saying a whole group is somehow incapable of managing their own life. And then we have this other piece around, well, we can't do it all overnight. I love this. 49 years is long enough to wait for equality. And we have drunk a toxic potion in this country of incremental equality. And let me tell you what it is. It is when you have deep levels of inequality across every dimension of a First Nations person's life. And every budget cycle, the government will come around and say, we're going to be the government that does more for Indigenous peoples than any other government, so we're going to give them more money for education. And we're going to roll it out over 5 years. And when you hear the rollout over 5 years, that's an alarm bell for any citizen, because that means the vast majority of money is projected for the next year of the election or the year after the election. But we're going to do this, and then the assumption, and sometimes even I felt it, like this last budget. I think I was the only ungrateful First Nations person on TV. I had folks saying, well, they gave you $71 million for job welfare. Aren't you grateful for that? And I said, if you're, a non-Aboriginal girl gave me one of the best definitions of discrimination. She said, Cindy, discrimination is when the government doesn't think you're worth the money. So if you were one of those children that wasn't worth the money, like those kids in Norway House, or you were the parent of a child who wasn't worth the money, and I'm going to give you a little bit more, but you're still not worth the money. Are you grateful? The poet Kilbrand, quoted by a 9-year-old, and I think those are the wisest people when it comes to reconciliation, by the way. 9-year-olds know how to do it. She's a non-Aboriginal girl, and she quotes the poet Kilbrand, saying, don't make the bully the hero. And that's what we've done with the Canadian government. We've made the bully the hero in the story of colonization, particularly in the contemporary context. Be nice to the government, because they're trying. They just can't change things overnight. And yet the people who are defenders of incremental equality are by and large those who are already being treated equal. Right? And they often are blind to the history that we just talked about, the multiple opportunities Canada has had to do the right thing and failed to do it. And also, of course, kids' childhoods are not incremental. I was 3 years old when Sims and Caldwell did their report. I know you're all very gracious, but I am not 3 years old anymore. I am 52. How many kids had to sacrifice their childhoods so that the government could fund other projects? What was more important than those kids? What did the kids lose to? The Olympics? The G20? Did we really need that new convention center? What about the moving expenses? Those are all the things the kids are losing throughout history. We, as the people of the period, are allowing our government to put other things as higher priorities. And we are allowing them to subsidize those higher priorities using racial discrimination against children. That's our responsibility, right? This is the number a million people look like. This is actually the Charlie Hebdo protest, to the tragedy in Paris. One of the documents that was filed at the tribunal when we took the government of Canada to court in 2007, alleging racially discriminating against 163,000 children. Some of you know from the documentary that came out, We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice, that I did my very best to try and hold my composure when I was on the witness stand for about 15 days. But there were some documents that literally made me sick. Literally made me sick. I had studied them and I had memorized them as paper because I knew I had to do that. I had to not just look at them as documents, but a part of the story. But when I heard my voice actually say it, I felt physically sick hearing myself say the words. And this is one of those documents. We have in academia and in society created a narrative that covers discrimination in a blanket of distance. Overrepresentation, we call it. Aboriginal people are overrepresented amongst people in the justice system, in child welfare. They're at the top of the list, as John Malloy says, of every list you don't want to be at the top of. on the bottom of every list that you do want to be at the top. We've created this whole language to protect ourselves. And this document stripped away all that language from me. Remember I told you First Nations kids are 12 times more likely to be in foster care? I can say that without wincing. But this was an Excel spreadsheet that counted it up the way the kids themselves think about it, which is how many sleeps till I see my mom and dad, or my sister, or my brother, or my dog. And if you added up all those numbers of nights that First Nations kids on reserve only and in the Yukon Territory spent in child welfare between 1989 and 2012, it's over 66 million nights, or 187,000 years of childhood. That's the cost of the government not acting on it. I was proud of our country when we brought over 30,000 refugees from Syria. So why aren't we bringing that can-do attitude to these children? Why are we allowing that not to happen, right? This is the case, and we actually have this whole website about inviting people to watch the case, Canadians to watch the case, because you are the people of the period. I don't want the people of the period not to know about this. And so we loaded all of Canada's court documents and all of ours, and after we filed the case in 2007, within 30 days we lost all of our federal court funding. That's what democracy is in Canada. But we had a great teaching, and I provide it to you here. It has been something that every day I wake up and I try to live my life by. It was by an elder. And he said, never fall in love with the caring society. And never fall in love with your business card. Only fall in love with the children, because there may come a day when you have to sacrifice both those things for them. And that day came in 2007. We had $50,000 in the bank to take on the largest law firm in the country, the government of Canada. A lot of really good, well-thinking people thought we had made a huge mistake. We were the only national organization standing for First Nations kids exclusively. They said, you're going to go down and there will be nobody talking. And I said, you're absolutely right, that probably is going to happen. After all, no other Aboriginal organization that I know of had survived 100% funding cut from the federal government and still made it. But I said, I want this generation of First Nations kids to know we love them and cared for them enough to fight for them. If that's the only thing we accomplish here, then I want them to know that. And amazingly, we were able to hang in there. We're still the only national organization with no money from any level of government, right? And over this next 9 years, I would never have predicted what happened. You see, the government of Canada fought this case on legal technicalities. Legal technicalities centering on its own fairness. It said, it is unfair to us, the federal government, to compare the services we provide to folks on reserve in this group to what everybody else gets from the provinces. That's not fair to us, the federal government. The second argument is, we actually don't deliver child welfare services anymore. We give it to community members. They have agencies that they've created. Now, I might be giving them a lot less money, but at the end of the day, if you're providing lesser services, it's you folks who are discriminating, not us, the government. Those are the arguments. And what was so interesting is when we launched the IMO, we launched the case in 2007, then National Chief Bill Fontaine of the Assembly of First Nations and I held a news conference, and almost nobody was there. I thought, what possibly could be more important than a news day than alleging the government is racially discriminating against 163,000 kids? Especially during the time, this is when Harper was about to warm up for the apology, right? That was being talked about. Surely reconciliation, I thought to myself, means not saying sorry twice. I can still remember my heels, the sound of my heels on the granite outside of Parliament. And nobody was there. They were echoing because nobody was there. There were people taking pictures of themselves in front of the eternal flame, but nobody was there for the kids. I felt like Bryce, like I was screaming into silence. Where was everybody? Where were the people of the period now? People know better now. They know racial discrimination isn't any good. Where is everybody? And that's what this campaign was meant to do, because I believe in the fundamental goodness of people. It was an invitation to watch. And as you can see now, it's one of the most watched human rights cases in Canadian history. And in January, as I've already told you, the government of Canada was found to be racially discriminating. But here is what racial discrimination looks like on a government PowerPoint. This is some of the evidence at file. You can see it's secret, so it wasn't meant to be seen by the public. And at the same time, they were talking about how much they cared about Aboriginal children. But here is how much they think they're shortfalling. Huh? This is 2012. This is in child welfare itself. That's quite a bit of change, right? Let's go to the next slide here. This is an interesting one because it's not secret, but is protected, which means we're not supposed to see this one either. But you can see here that they are recognizing shortfalls in social and education programs. And the deficits are so bad that they're having to transfer money out of what they call infrastructure, which is the money used for building water systems, houses, schools, fire protection on reserves. You know the horror stories you've seen of so many fires. Well, money they would announce for fire protection in the infrastructure budget was being reallocated to try and cover the shortfalls in these other programs because they were so severe. Keep in mind that when the Conservatives turned over to the Liberal government, they were out there campaigning saying they were running a surplus budget, right? Because they weren't going to Treasury Board to try and top up these programs. They were literally shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. There are other documents in the trial that came to evidence that are appalling to me. One is a 4-year-old little girl who went into routine surgery and something went horribly wrong. It's the Christmas season again, not 1923 like with Edward B., but rather about 2013. And she needs a piece of equipment so she can breathe. The request for the equipment so that she can breathe goes through the hands of 14 different public officials before somebody finally writes on there, absolutely not, with an underline. Absolutely not, we're not paying for this breathing equipment. It took a citizen, a private citizen, with a heart much bigger than the government's to do that. And what we heard in testimony is the government bureaucrat saying the floodgates are open. Well, if we gave her breathing equipment, who knows how many other kids who want to breathe will want them. That's how normalized it's become. Huh? I don't know about you, but I pay taxes, a lot of them. And that's exactly what I hope my tax dollars goes to, right? I don't care how many kids out there who can't breathe. Give them everything I've got, right? While we're waiting for the decision, the TRC comes out with its ruling, its report. And child welfare is the top call to action. The Prime Minister Trudeau stands up and he says, we're going to implement them all. Of course, then he was in the official opposition. And, well, not even the official opposition. I guess they were in the second official opposition. But we're going to implement all these things, and that was a welcome decision. The TRC made child welfare its top call to action because it wants to stop the unnecessary removals of kids from their families. Then the decision comes out. Did I tell you that when I went to see Bryce, I told him about the case? And I told him back in 2008 that I'd be back when the children won. I had no idea that it would take so long to go back to see him. I remember I was at a graduation party for a social worker student when the decision came in. You see, I got the decision 2 days before you saw it. And it was something that had encompassed my life and the lives of so many others who had worked for justice on this case. And it arrived unceremoniously with a beef on an aisle. When I saw it there, the whole world went silent. All the joyous noise around me disappeared and time itself stopped moving. It took me moments to get the courage enough to even press that button. Because whatever was in there was going to affect 163,000 children and their descendants. When I finally got mounted the courage, I remember my hand, literally just my finger touching that file. And then it loaded. And then the first words in the decision was, this is about children, underlined. And I knew it would be okay. The first thing I thought of, I had to get out of it. I went down to a florist, and I found the brightly colored Gerber daisies I could find. I got my snow boots on, and this teddy bear called Spirit Bear, who had been watching all the hearings. And by now, the children had dressed him in his own regalia. He has his own ribbon shirt and moccasins and everything else. So he and I went to Beechwood Cemetery. And I had him in a shopping bag. And I put on my boots. It was probably 30 or below zero. And it was a sunny day, and I could see the top of Bryce's headstone in the snow. And I walked down the valley, leaving behind me a lone trail of footsteps. And as I looked back, they were glistening in the snow, but to me, it wasn't the footsteps of one person. Behind were all the Edward Bees, all the Dr. Bryces, all the chiefs, all the Blakes, all the parents, everyone who had raised the alarm and stood up for these kids. I put the teddy bear on top of Dr. Bryce's headstone, and I read him the judgment. Alone in the cemetery, in front of that nodding maple tree, that told the story of reconciliation, that it's a messy affair of struggles and of pushback, even when you're fighting for what seems so eminently right, as Bryce did. And then I put the flowers at his grave, and I hugged his headstone, and I said, justice, Dr. Bryce, finally, justice. I walked back out, something that Cheney never had a chance to do. I walked back out, and I had to make another visit. Sorry, we'll quickly through this. I wanted to go there. See, Duncan Campbell Scott's buried there too. Just over the rise of Peter Henderson Bryce, as history would happen. I had been to see Duncan Campbell Scott the day before the TRC's closing ceremonies. I knew he was there for many, many months, but you see, I wouldn't go near where he was buried because I knew his 12-year-old daughter was buried there with him. He was, by all accounts, a loving father. He had, actually, in the most ironic of tragedies, he had sent her away at the age of 12 to study in a school in Paris, and she contracted scarlet fever and dies there. Right around the same time that Bryce issues his report. I wanted to make sure when I went there that I was able to honor her in the way that she needed to be honored. So I went there the day before the TRC ceremony, and I did my bit. You know, I laid tobacco at a grave, and I prayed His Spirit would guide this generation of bureaucrats and the people to do the right thing. And then I went by this historical plaque that talked about all the great things that Duncan Campbell Scott had done as a poet. And I thought to myself, that needs a revision. So now Duncan Campbell Scott has another plaque that includes the words cultural genocide and Confederate poet in the same plaque. Now, I had Spirit Bear there with me that day, but I told him he had to stay in the bag for this visit. His ears were poking out. And I read Duncan Campbell Scott the decision to. And I prayed that his spirit would guide this generation of bureaucrats to do the right thing. When Scott, just before he died, writes a letter to his publisher, he says, "I've never done anything courageous in my entire life." I think that sums up the teaching that both Bryce and Scott have to offer us. Here we have two men of the period, both non-Aboriginal, both going to the same church, both federal bureaucrats, confronted with the dying of children. One conforms and says we can't save the money. He gets rewarded for his views. He's celebrated in Canadian culture. The other stands up for the kids, is punished, persecuted, and forgotten. There's rewards for doing the wrong thing in our society. And yet, as we know, as has been said many times, the arc of justice, it takes a long time, but it does arc towards justice. And that's why today, Peter Henderson Bryce's grave has a plaque honoring him, and W. Campbell Scott is so remembered. Right? He's so remembered. Duncan Campbell Scott's office building is still there. You can walk further down on Spark Street, and you come to something called the Booth Building. His office was on the top floor. Now, don't you think history's got a bit of a sense of humor sometimes? I wonder what Duncan Campbell Scott would have thought if he realized that years later, new tenants would move in. They don't work there anymore. They moved, but that was their office for many years. Now, what's happened since the ruling? The Government of Canada has failed to comply with the ruling. It's been issued 2 compliance orders by the Canadian government for failing to comply, or by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal for failing to comply. It touted Budget 2016, the $71 million, as being the proper response to the tribunal's decision. And then, finally, after the tribunal ordered it to release information about the timing of when this response was prepared, on September 30th, my birthday as it happened, the Government of Canada submitted a filing to the tribunal saying, well, there was just one technical problem. We created this whole budget in September of last year. That makes it the Conservative government's plan. And that was created many months before the tribunal ever ruled, and it was never changed. Christy Kirkup from the Canadian Press is one of the media who keeps the story alive, and she asked Prime Minister Trudeau, she said, why is the Government of Canada not complying with these 3 legal orders to stop racially discriminating against kids? To which he responds, we as a government are the ones who have done more for Indigenous people. We've announced $6.84 billion. We are doing all of these good things. And then Christy, she asks the famous follow-up question. She says, Prime Minister, if your budget isn't good enough for the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, why is it good enough for you? It's a fair question. And it's a fair question for all of you too. You are the people of the period. You are the people that those children, the 163,000 children, are asking to hear. What are you going to do? How many letters have you written to your elected officials and the Prime Minister saying that in 2016 there's no excuse for racial discrimination against kids? And if you even remotely want me to vote for you or your party, you're going to stop it now. The government is still saying we can't change things overnight, be patient. Well, I don't know about you, but as a citizen, if I violated 3 legal orders, I'd be wearing an orange jumpsuit by now. You don't get to set your own pace of compliance with the law, and certainly not over a 5-year budget cycle. So do something. Be that person for Cheney Windjack that you couldn't be back then. But be that person for this generation of kids now. Because at the end of the day, reconciliation means more than just caring. It means doing something to put this horrible and egregious past of racial discrimination behind us. And if we do, maybe next year we can give Canada the best 150th birthday present it has ever gotten. And that is to release it from the shackles of racial discrimination as government policy for now and forever. Thank you very much. And just so you know, there's 7 free ways to make a difference for kids on that website. So for students, I know you're broke, but it's no excuse. You can go help.
We just wanted to announce then that there's a bit of a Q&A session if anyone has any questions. If you don't mind.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes, but
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
great, thank you.
My time is regulated by the shuttle driver, so I think I'm good. He or she shows up.
Okay, so there's a question right back there. Yeah, just stand up and project.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. It's a little bit heartbreaking to hear all the things that, you know, as Canadians or as a society, as a country that has happened. I appreciate where we're at now and that we are looking at moving forward. I'm just curious to know, and this is a big question, so we can just kind of touch on it a little bit. So how do we as Canadians or as a government, how is that leeway being made? So in your opinion, are you seeing those relationships starting to form where the Indigenous people, the Aboriginal community, has more of a voice? Is that something that is being recognized, or a feeling still that government is still having most of the power?
It's a good question. I think many people would have different answers. Here's mine. I think that thanks to the courage of the survivors from residential schools and many others who were persecuted outside of residential schools. We think of the horror of residential school being those buildings, but of course it was much broader. I think that people are starting to realize, but it's often on the symbols. Like we've seen the outcry now about the Cleveland Indians. And people seem to be all rallying around that. But the structural discrimination, the discrimination perpetrated by governments, that's still something that people find even more hard to deal with for some reason. And I think that's where we have to bring the dialogue. You know, what I have come to understand is governments do not create change. Governments respond to change. And that's why it's so critical that we, the people of the period, demand that change. I think the Prime Minister is sincere in his thoughts, but his thoughts don't matter. I've seen a lot of sincere Prime Ministers and politicians over the ages. But the discrimination continues to be perpetrated. And that's really where I measure progress, is at the level of kids. And if their childhoods are not getting better, if their childhoods are not being treated equally, then people like you need to keep talking. And don't stop, even if you think no one's listening, because eventually someone will. That's what I tell the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit young people. Keep talking, because someone eventually will listen. And I think that's our great hope, as we're seeing more Canadians come to understand this.
Do you know the book Clearing the Plains?
Yes, I do. I've read it.
I just wanted to ask for your comment on that part where he talks about sometime in the 1870s or so, where there was one group of Aboriginal people, one tribe or one nation, who was skilled enough at farming that they were actually training some of the settlers who came over from Europe. And because they were prosperous enough, they didn't require depending on a government that was starving other nations to death. And when the mumps and the flu came through, they didn't get sick because they were well fed. And for me, it was so powerful to see that if only people have enough, things get better. And I heard that a lot in your talk in terms of the child and family services, even education, all of that. I'm just wondering if you could comment a bit on that.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I think your question raises for me is, and also just connected to what you were saying, is when there is dialogue now on Aboriginal peoples, it's about our pain. No one talks about the many contributions we've given to this country. Like, talk to the Haudenosaunee about how corn is actually made. Corn does not grow to be that husk, you know? There was some kind of wonderful science that they had managed through the years that allowed for corn, which is one of the greatest sustenances of people around the world, to actually even exist. The name of the country does not come from the French, the Vikings, or the Brits. Toronto is a First Nations word. There's caucus is a First Nations political system. So we have negated, again, that idea of the savage and the civilized is we have nothing to give you. We've given nothing. We are the takers, right? And so that's a story that needs to be shared. And as you point out, the reason the other people were starving was because Canada annihilated the buffalo, right? Which is the food sustenance of these other peoples. So farmers, in the midst of that, were able to sustain themselves. Bringing that whole thing into contemporary reality, there was some of you know about the Paul Martin Initiative on education, right? Well, that initiative, along with a couple of other school boards, brought 2 First Nations schools up to funding on par, right?
Manitoba, right?
In Manitoba and 1 here in Ontario. And ask the question, how long would it take for these kids to actually function at the same? Well, within 2 years, those kids were performing at the same level as other kids or surpassing them, right? So it's clearly not a function of the children, but what treasures me so deeply and what brings back to Jean's comment is many of our kids on reserve don't know that they're being discriminated against. So the biggest tragedy of this racial discrimination I see when I travel and talk to children and young people in our communities is that they have internalized this we're not worth the money. They don't know they're getting less. All they can see is through the internet and the TV, other kids who are doing better, and a Canadian public who often doesn't know any better, judging them as if they get more, which makes them feel like they're not smart, like they're not worth it, that they're not going to ever become anybody, because look at their families, they've never gone to education. And so they kill themselves. Because dying is a better choice than what we have to offer them in Canada. And so we need to change that. We need to allow all those children to have an equitable opportunity, but in ways that honor their cultures. Because if we do, we'll have more farmers who are surviving the famine. Yes?
So you talked about 50% of children in foster care are Indigenous children. So I'm just wondering what you would suggest that schools of social work need to do to start preparing social workers to become better advocates of children.
Yeah, it's a great question. So what do we have to do in schools of social work to prepare people to be better advocates? Number one, teach them the history of social work. Is that we were not just standing by in this whole enterprise, we were actually involved in it. It frustrates me when I see social work associations say, we're going to take up the calls to action. And I think that's great, but maybe we should kind of look in the mirror first. Let's see what were the values and beliefs of our profession that allowed that to happen in the first place. And in social work, I wrote this article, I don't know if you've ever read it, it's called The Occasional Evil of Angels. And I try to untease a bit of that by saying, we are a profession without any democratic vote. And that makes us very dangerous to a whole pile of people when you have no democratic vote. That presumption of benevolence is dangerous in any profession. So I'd like to see schools of social work teach the real history of social work and its relationship to Indigenous communities. I'd like us to talk about moral courage, which is something that I think is really, I've been inspired by in my own life. There's a YouTube channel called Moral Courage. Check it out. So what moral courage is it says really in Western society that people are conditioned to recognize physical courage. So if I was heading back to Toronto, we saw in our shuttle somebody with an accident, we jump out, we help. We'll be on a picture of the newspaper with the mayor with medals around our neck within 24 hours, right? But we punish moral courage. We punish people like Bryce who speak out. We call them troublemakers, insubordinate, disloyal, rockers of the boat, all kinds of things. And when people like Rutherford Kidder, who studied this concept a lot, they say when we are going to be morally courageous, we're more likely to do it for ourselves or for our family. But he says what we really need in social work is for people to be morally courageous for people who will never know to be thankful to. So how do you be courageous, and how do you take the blowback? Because one of the things that no one ever taught me in social work is how important courage is. In courage and respect, working with people instead of for people. But how that actually works in a social movement. I was standing there fighting for equity for kids. I would have never, ever in my wildest dreams have thought that the government of Canada would deploy 189 different federal public servants to follow my movements to try and find other motives for the child welfare case. Follow me as far away as the desert of Australia where they have detailed notes about what I was saying. So how do you do it? And how do you prepare yourself for those moments of courage? I'd like to see that talk. And then the third thing is how do you, as one person or a small group, take something on as big as the government of Canada and win? And that's what I teach at McGill. So you can come and check out our workshop. Come to McGill, we'll teach you.
Okay, I think we've unfortunately run out of time because we have to move over to our circle
Yeah.
sessions, which are beginning at 11:00.
I have to go with the shuttle driver, but can I ask, how many of you are actually going to get on here and sign up for these campaigns? For those of you who are not, for those of you who are not, I'm going to ask you, if you're unconvinced by what I'm saying, try to prove me wrong. The government of Canada has, and they have not been successful. So maybe you could offer them some tips. But also, for those of you who are not, who are doing other things, continue to do those things, but don't ignore this. This is our Mississippi, this is our Confederate flag. And by not doing anything about it, you're being discrimination's best friend.